Thank you so much. We have 40 minutes. So anyone who is interested in the benchmarking statistics that I shared in the keynote address this morning, we're going to spend the next 40 minutes going through the survey design, the survey analysis, the goals, and hopefully we'll have I'm sure we're going to have time for questions and answers afterwards. So the flow for the next part of this presentation is to go through the demographics of the finding, the key findings, and then what really excites me is the actual mechanics of the survey methodology and analysis. So this benchmarking effort started 2 years ago with just Humble and I, and thank goodness we have Dr. Nicole Forsgren helping us this year that brought a level of professionalism and smartness that we didn't have. So she's going to share that. We're going to talk about the key predictors of IT performance. We're going to talk a little bit more about the organizational culture. That was the third highest level of third highest predictor of performance. Job satisfaction, biggest surprises. So with that, let's turn it over to Nicole.
Great, thank you. So quick overview, key players in the report this year. Myself, Gene, Jez Humble, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. He's in Denmark. And Nigel, who we saw this morning, but is somewhere running the show. And of course, we definitely want to mention everyone else at Puppet who was huge contributor and help in the report this year. Demographics, as we go through and we look at people who took the survey, we had over 9,200 responses covering over 110 countries all over the world. We covered several industries. We covered technology, we covered finance, we covered retail, we covered so many different industries, so many different countries. This really helped give us confidence in the results that we found, really lends credibility to the results and to the generalizability of the findings. So generalizability means what we find really probably extends to not just the people who took the survey, but to several other companies and organizations as well. Size of organizations. We covered several different sizes as well. So we covered size of organizations, 500 employees to over 10,000 employees. We covered small organizations. We covered large organizations. What does this mean? It's not just the unicorns, like Gene said this morning, right? We're covering horses, we're covering unicorns, we're covering large and small companies. We're getting all sorts of sizes of organizations, all sorts of sizes of teams that are using DevOps. We had some really interesting results here. So again, this is a good hint to generalizability, right? This isn't just limited to the people that took the survey.
In fact, could we talk about one of the specific kind of objections that came when we released the findings was that these are only unicorns. This the findings cannot be extrapolated to the large, complex organizations, to which you said that that's not true, that the findings can be generalized to the larger organizations at large. Could you just maybe say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, we have good evidence that the findings can be extended to large organizations for several reasons. First of all, we had responses from large organizations, right? We have lots and lots of responses from large organizations. Second of all, I did lots and lots of statistical tests to check for that, right? So I compared responses from small organizations to responses from large organizations to see if they were actually statistically different, and they aren't. They don't look any different. So if I try to compare the two and do like a blind taste test, they look the same, right? People in large organizations and small organizations who are doing DevOps, if I compare those two populations, they look really similar. So we have a lot of evidence to suggest that DevOps is happening all over the place. Size of infrastructure, right? So over half the respondents said their infrastructure included less than 500 servers. So a lot of the times we are seeing smaller size organizations in terms of size of infrastructure, but that also means that we're seeing 49% of our respondents with large infrastructures, right? So we're seeing good coverage in terms of sizes here, okay? Departments. This was interesting, right? Nigel really keyed in on some of the responses here. This was interesting. When we asked people where they worked, what does your job title include? 16% of people worked in a job function that actually include DevOps in their title. So some people worked in dev, some people worked in ops, some people worked in something that, sometimes our job title just says something that has nothing to do with like what we actually do, right? 16% of people worked in a job function that actually said DevOps in their title, or their team said DevOps in something. And this is interesting, right? Because we kind of talked a lot about this in the team, and we thought, well, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is this causing problems? Is this creating another silo, right? Do we have the dev team and the ops team, and then a whole other team way over here that's called the DevOps team that's just creating another problem? Or is this a whole other culture that's being created and we're calling ourselves DevOps, right? In some ways, this is a good thing, because if we're calling ourselves DevOps, we're self-identifying with this culture. This could be a good thing. So
the results may surprise you.
Results may surprise you. So this is one of those things we want to dig into next year, when we get to our future research slide. So where have we come from? DevOps Grows Up. 2012, kind of the first round, right? What is DevOps? It's the first round of the survey. Really tried to dig into what is this thing that's DevOps. The 2013 survey revealed that the DevOps adoption, the DevOps thing that's out there is accelerating. This year, the results were fantastic. DevOps, not only is DevOps out there, but DevOps works. DevOps has an impact. And it doesn't just have an impact in our IT function. It doesn't just have an impact in our IT function, in our IT teams, right? It doesn't just make us feel better in IT. It helps our companies. This has an impact on the bottom line, which is huge. And I'll get to this later, because this is a big, big deal.
Thank you, Nicole. So in terms of why I care, I shared a lot of it in the keynote earlier, but I love this phrase from Dr. Deming. He said, change is not mandatory, but neither is survival. The whole notion of how do we elevate the state of the practice, not just in the unicorns, but in the enterprise at large. And I think if the goal is to accelerate the rate of adoption, the goal really is, one of the intermediate objectives is, how do we show that it's worth the journey? And so, this is actually an extension of some work that I did earlier in terms of what we call cross-population studies. So I love this sort of spectrum of what do we use to persuade? On the one hand, we have anecdotes, things that we read on Twitter, peer recommendations, we heard it from a friend, prior experience in terms of it worked, when I did something, in a previous job. Then, the ROI story, that often comes from vendors. Then, ultimately, sometimes you get, a set of best practices. And then, then we start approaching the benchmarks. And what I love so much about the last 2 years of the DevOps survey of practice is that it is really a cross-population study. These are the same sort of techniques that they use to actually find, that smoking caused cancer, right? So this is what they use to say, if you identify the population of those who smoke versus those who don't, right, there's a statistical difference in terms of early morbidity and so forth of those who smoke more than those who don't. I didn't realize this, but there's actually in the academic circles a negative connotation to cross-population studies, which I thought was the pinnacle of science. But the goal was, especially working with Nicole, was to actually elevate the methodology so that it's not only cross-population study, but it also would meet the criteria of the most stringent academic journals. Anything to add on that?
Nope, that's it. So now our yellow bar kind of grows a little bit, right? So we do have an academic rigorous study, and right now I'm working on parsing out some of the data, and we're submitting this to strong peer-reviewed academic journals. So for anyone who have bosses that really want that academic peer review, this data's going there.
Right. And by the way, if there's one thing that I've learned about researchers is that when you are a non-tenured professor who wants tenure, you need papers, right? And so large studies like this are phenomenal source material for papers. So now that we have a little bit more time, I want to walk through what the key findings were in terms of what we call the performance metrics, right? So think about on the x-axis, we have a set of activities, right? We smoke or we don't smoke. We exercise, we don't exercise, right? That's on the x-axis, those are the dependent variables, and then on the y-axis is I should put it this way, the y-axis are the outcome measures. So what you see up here are the outcome measures, the performance measures. So we found that the high performers do exist, and we put them onto two axes. One is throughput, there was the work out, the rate of work, and then the quality measures. So the throughput measures are how often is DevOps deploying, right? Whether that's in the code or in the environment, and then we measured the lead time as we go from code committed through the test cycle, through the deployment cycle, to successfully running in production. And what I love about the lead time metrics is that if you look at the lean community, especially in manufacturing, there's a deeply held belief that lead time is the most effective predictor of quality, customer satisfaction, and employee happiness, right? And so it was really exciting to be able to put those hypotheses to the test, and we actually found that to be very true in the DevOps space as well. So lead time. And then the reliability measures, right? We don't achieve the goal if we are deploying 30 times a day, 1,000 times a day, and every time we do it, it causes a Sub 1 outage, right? So we measured the change success rate. In other words, when you do a deploy, what percentage of them result in a success versus something unwanted, and then the recovery time. In other words, how long does it take to recover, restore service when something goes wrong? So the reason why we're so excited about this finding when it came up last year was that it was the first empirical evidence that you could actually go faster and get better outcomes at the same time, right? You could break that core chronic conflict, right? So that's exciting. So at Nicole's urging, we also tested not only just IT performance. So IT performance is the 3 or 4 tuple, that is deployment frequency, lead time, change success rate, mean time to repair. We also tested organizational performance, which was, on a scale of 1 to 7, what was the exact wording?
How likely is your organization to exceed goals in profitability, market share, productivity goals?
Right. Awesome. Right. So those organizations that were high performing not only had great IT performance, they also had great organizational performance. And in my mind, like one of the most exciting things was, asking for a stock ticker symbol, so that we could also, and then when we ran the analysis, we found that, of the high, medium, low performers, the high performers had a 50% higher market cap growth over 3 years than the medium and low performers, which is like so exciting. I mean, it means that, and I think that the conjecture, right, is that as increasingly the value creation mechanism and the customer acquisition vehicle of the organization becomes IT, right, those who do that well will massively outperform those who don't, right, and will even show up in something like stock performance, which is absurd and yet totally believable. Any comments on that?
No, I'll get to it.
Okay. Any questions or comments on this before we go on?
Yeah.
Distinction between companies whose business is delivering software versus those who just are dependent on software.
Oh, yeah, of course. Right. The question is, well, obviously the high performers are going to be the ones who are like Google, Amazon, versus the organizations that aren't so reliant upon IT.
Yeah, so distinctions between companies who actually deliver software as their product versus companies who just use software.
Yeah, and I would say we found high performers across every industry vertical.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I don't think we have the exact stats on that. And by the way, this was, in the Phoenix project, the fictitious company being depicted was a parts manufacturer and a retailer. We actually were thinking about making them a gravel manufacturer, just to show that, even if our business is crushing rocks, right, without our IT systems, we don't even know where to ship them, where we can sell them. The order entry systems are all entirely reliant upon IT. So, our hypothesis is that this spans all verticals, and I think the data does support that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I looked at that. Okay, so how we collected responses. We did this through Snowball sampling. So Snowball sampling is not going to be a truly randomized sample. For those of you who know stats, a truly randomized sample requires you to know the entire population, which is like knowing everyone who works in ops and dev and DevOps, and then taking a randomized sample. Well, that's not possible, right? Because we already talked about the fact that we don't necessarily know who everyone is because it doesn't always say dev or ops or DevOps in your title. So what we do instead is we do snowball sampling, and this is a very common and understood and statistically valid way to collect samples, particularly in communities that are engaged and have strong online communities and have strong connectedness, who know each other. So what we do is we put out a strong social marketing campaign, we let everyone know, and we say let everyone else know. It kind of builds like a snowball. So those are some of the methods that we used. We see this through several methods. And again, because we saw such a strong response rate across so many countries, so many industries, we do have very, very good evidence that our results are valid. And again, I did additional statistical tests to compare early and late responders across countries, across several other different things. Our results look valid. I also tested for common method variance, common method bias. Our results look robust. Questions we asked. Now, I jumped in this year and I convinced the team that we needed to ask our questions a little differently. So instead of asking yes/no questions, black or white, I said, no, we really need to ask things Likert style. So for anyone here who took the survey, you may have recognized it. I love you, really. Thank you.
We are deeply grateful.
Yes, love you from the bottom of my heart. You may have recognized Likert-style questions, right? Instead of just a yes or no, we call it a Likert type question. Strongly disagree to strongly agree. Instead of just a black or white, a yes or no, this gives me nuance. This gives me shades of gray. This gives me something to work with. I converted almost all of our questions into Likert style, and for anything new that we added this year, I converted it into Likert style. This lets me do so much more. This gives me so much more to work with. You also may have noticed that some of the questions seem to ask something similar. Again, bless you for your patience. I love you. Because what this does is when I have shades of gray, when I have nuance, and when I have a few questions that seem to get at the same idea, it lets me combine items. It lets me get at something called a construct. It lets me measure things that we haven't been able to measure before. So in the past, we had black and white. We had yes and no. We had very clear-cut things. But we couldn't get at subtle differences between or across or among people or teams or organizations. So once I have a Likert type question and it takes just a few more seconds for y'all to answer these questions, now I can capture things called latent constructs. Okay? So a latent construct is something that can't be measured directly. Something that can be measured directly is like a temperature, right? I can walk into a room, I can take a temperature of a room. Something that can't be measured directly is like happiness or wellness. It's really hard for me to just get a number for that, right? That's tricky. But what I can do now that I have Likert type questions, and if I have 2 or 3 or 4 of those that are very similar and that are around the same idea, is if they're based in theory, and if they're carefully constructed based on expert opinion, and if they're worded just the right way, very, very perfectly and very, very carefully, I can combine them just the right way using very careful statistical methods. Some people call it an art. It's actually part art, part science, called psychometrics. But I can combine them in very certain ways. And I can combine them into something called a latent construct. This is what we were able to do this year. And it was really, really exciting. So we were able to take these 3 things that Jean talked about, mean time to repair, and how often you deploy, and lead time. And we also looked at change fail rate. And we were able to combine them. We were able to test them several different ways. Change fail rate dropped out. I'll talk about that in a minute. But we were able to combine them and be able to come up with one measure, to test, to come up with IT performance. We can basically now come up with and give an organization or a team their DevOps temperature. This is big. This is actually a really big deal. It was really, really exciting for our team. We were all kind of doing a little dance. It was very, very cool. Coming up with psychometric measures, coming up with latent constructs is really tough. It takes a lot of work. Remember how a second ago we went through all of those years of all of the work that we've done over years of the DevOps survey? It takes 2 or 3 years to refine these measures. So now we have our IT perf measure. We actually combined and used a few measures that have been previously validated in previous research, and we used those in the study this year as well. So when we quantify IT performance, again, it was deploy frequency, mean time to recover, lead time for changes. When we combine these 3 measures, we have IT performance in the context of DevOps. We can measure an organization or a team's DevOps temperature now with a single number. This is great, right? This is huge because now we can use this number as a single scale. Once I have this number, I can throw this number into several different things that, like stats, numbers people use, right? I can see how it correlates with other things. I can see how it regresses or predicts different things. Once I have a number, I can do a lot with it. So this was great for us.
Maybe one concrete observation on that. Can you go back and I sure hope I'm right on this. So the fact that IT performance can be measured as a 3-tuple. That means as deployment frequency goes up, lead time goes down, and mean time to prepare goes down. Those 3 measures go up and down together, right, in high performers. So, how cool is that? So it says kind of, I love this phrase, the goal of science is to explain the most amount of observable phenomena with the fewest number of principles, confirm deeply held intuitions and reveal surprising insights. I mean, I think this was like one of those, aha moments that definitely came in the study for me.
Yes. And by the way, this is all like, there's lots and lots of like stats behind this. I think someone earlier, someone wanted me to say like eigenvalues. So this is all based on like exploratory factor analysis, meaning at least an eigenvalue of 1 and factors loading greater than 0.5 and Cronbach's alpha greater than 0.7 and composite reliability greater than 0.7. Do we want more stats things thrown out there?
You haven't done data analysis until you could get to watch Nicole in front of SPSS for like an hour. It's
Every
like
once in a while, Gino will be like, just share your screen. Just let me watch. You know it's bad when you get a text message from Gene at 11 o'clock at night, and he's like, can we do data analysis? It's good. So we're all excited. We've got IT perf for organizations, and we know it's based on 3 things, okay? Change fail rate dropped out. We're going to look into it this year. We think we have a few ideas about why that may have happened. It could have been because of the way it was worded. Honestly, it could be because we don't actually let things fail now the way they used to fail. Like, we don't let things fail and like actually come crashing all the way down, right? That doesn't really happen, hopefully. Doesn't like really happen anymore, right? Like, they don't come crashing all the way down. So change fail rate fell out, but we have 3 things. So at this point, we wanted to be able to come up with a way to categorize organizations or teams according to these 3 things. So at this point, we could have just come up with like a cut point, except I like stats. And so I wanted to use another stats method, and we decided to use cluster analysis. So what we did for that is we used these 3 measures because through all of these exciting stats things that all these words I just threw out, we knew these 3 measures were the ones that were important: MTTR, deploy frequency, and lead time. Cluster analysis is interesting because what it does is it kind of throws these 3 measures in there. And cluster analysis says, group these 3 things together so that the things that are more alike are very alike to each other and very different from other groups. So the organizations or the teams that are alike will cluster together and will be, so high-performing IT organizations will be very similar to other high IT organizations, IT perf, and will be very different from low IT perf organizations, and will be very different from medium IT perf organizations. And those that are low IT performing organizations will be similar to other low IT performing organizations, but will be very different from the medium IT performing organizations, okay? And then it just categorizes them, puts them into buckets for me, okay? So we did that. I wanted to see what happened, and I just let it ride. right? So here's the other really interesting thing. If I had done it based on my IT temperature, right, and had come up with cut points, I would have had to tell it a priori. I would have had to tell it ahead of time, I want to have this many cut points. I would have had to tell it, give me 3 buckets, give me 2 groups, give me, however many buckets. Cluster analysis, I can say, let it ride, right? Throw it in, tell me how many groups you think make sense. It told me 3 groups tell the best story, and this is what it looks like. So it liked 3 groups, high, medium, and low, and it was clean. That's the other really interesting thing about this data set. I mean, all the analyses that we did were just clean, clean, clean. And that doesn't happen when you have over 9,200 survey responses. I mean, this was like out of a textbook almost. It was unbelievable. So we came up with our cluster analysis. So remember I said, so I did this through my organizations. We have our high, medium, low IT performers. Remember I said that change fail rate dropped out? I really wanted to bring it back in just to see what would happen, okay? So I brought it back in at this point and I said, I know it can't be used to classify high, medium, and low IT organizations, IT perf, but can it still, how does it behave? Is it still statistically different? And guess what? It is. And not only is it statistically significantly different, it behaves exactly the same way we would expect it to. So it's not good as a classifier, but it still behaves exactly how we'd expect it to.
Thanks. And so what I love about the decisiveness of the findings this year is that, each one of not only do we find, 3 clusters of performers, high, medium, and low, but we now have enough data to be able to substantiate the top predictors of performance, right? So correlation doesn't equal causality, but Nicole assures me when the results are this decisive, we can actually now say, here are the 7 top predictors of performance.
Strongly suggests, but yes.
Right.
So I will say, if I publish this in a business journal, I can say predicts and it's fine. If I go to a psych journal, they'll be a little upset, but I can say predicts, and we've got a strong R-squared.
We're trying to get a paper into the Harvard Business Review, and Nicole has assured everybody that the use of the word predict in that context is still okay.
Yeah, HBR is going to let us say predict, and so far they like it.
Awesome. So I'll go through kind of what the top 10 predictors of performance are, but so that we can take each one of these performance measures and then see what technical practices or the deep independent variables predict performance. So let's take mean time to repair. The top predictor of mean time to repair was version control of the environment, right, which I just love, right? And the second one is this notion of proactively monitoring the production environment, which also totally makes sense, right? You can't have short mean time to repair if the way you find out about outages is a customer telling you, right? That you have to have, that information, alerting coming in from, inside the operations organization or whatever, inside of the environment. So then lead time for changes. Again, the top predictor was version control of production artifacts, and it was actually both, right? To what extent are you checking in code? To what extent are you checking in production environments? And the goal is that you can not only recreate the production environment based only on what's in version control. I think what the suggestion here is that you can't get fast flow of work through dev, test, and operations if dev can't recreate the production environment, a production-like environment in dev, right? So this ensures that dev, test, and prod all remain synchronized. And clearly you can't get fast lead time if you have a lot of manual testing. So top predictors, version control of the code and the environment, and automated testing. Deployment frequency. The top predictors there was the notion of continuous integration and continuous delivery practices. So those are like, we have continuous builds, we have continuous integration happening. Developers are checking in code daily. And again, that actually is predicated on version control, right? Because where does the test environment, the code environment, and the test come from? They come from version control, right? Not a wiki page, not a Word document. And then change fail rate. It had a slightly different property than the other performance measures, but it is, it is a good performance measure. Actually, let me just maybe one discussion item. So Roy Rappaport at Netflix, when we first presented these findings a year ago in 2013, his reaction was this. He said, high performers actually fail more often. He said, if you're doing 30 times more frequent deployments and your change success rate is only is only twice as good, you actually have far higher number of outages and incidents. Does that make sense? In other words, to have parity, to have change success rate constant, you need to have 30. If you have 30 times more frequent deployment, you have to have a 1/30th chance of a failure. So the notion is high performers inherently will fail more often. The difference is that when those failures happen, the organization can detect and correct for it quickly. Make sense? Yeah. So I think that is, in my opinion, one of the reasons that the change fail rate is not like the others. So here are kind of an itemized list of the top predictors. Any comments, criticisms, concerns? All right. So here's the top predictors of performance as, in what order? I'll figure it out by the end of the slide. OK, one of them was this notion of peer review of production changes, as opposed to requiring approval from some sort of external authority, right? Like a typical enterprise change approval board, right? We found that high performers rely not on change approvals, but on the peer review of changes, whether it's code or in the environment. We talked about version control of the environment. We talked about proactive monitoring of the production environment. And then up there was this notion of a high trust culture, right? And we used the Westrom typology model. That actually came from the healthcare industry. They found that one of the top predictors of patient safety was the organizational culture, right? And so apparently it is true for healthcare organizations, and it is equally true in the DevOps value stream as well. And apparently, when you have those things in place, that creates a sense of a win-win relationship between DevOps and information security, which also result in a sense of high job satisfaction, which I think is a wonderful finding because there's been a multi-decade body of knowledge that says job satisfaction is highly correlated with organizational performance.
Absolutely.
Nicole has this phrase, just like happy cows lead to happier milk, right? So too do happier DevOps teams result in better IT performance and organizational performance. The reason why I love these 7 predictors of performance is that when I see that list, right, what I see is this wonderful model that Elizabeth Hendrickson came up with. So she was one of the first people who did benchmarking of, what is the right ratio of dev to test, right? And like one of the kind of decisive findings was like, it really doesn't matter. It seems like whenever you have dev, a separate test department, the highest performers were the organization that had no test department, right? I mean, so one of the suggestions was that maybe having quality be someone else's job, actually reduces performance, right? And so she came up with this model of, fast feedback loops, basically making all of QA look like a feedback loop. So this notion of, automated unit tests, system tests, CI build with test exploration, exploratory testing, and then even A/B testing. This is basically the concentric ring of feedback loops we need. Not through just dev, test, and ops, but all the way from the organization to customer satisfaction. So I just thought that was this seemed to be validating that model. Just one last brief discussion item on organizational culture. So this is the Westrom typology model. Dr. Westrom pioneered this model for the use in healthcare industries. And we found the numbers at the bottom here show that 15% of the organizations of the 9,600 organizations were pathological, 52% were bureaucratic, and 33% were generative. And there's actually a really shocking finding about you can even find these high trust cultures even in large organizations of 10,000 employees or more. I have that slide later.
Yeah.
Any questions, comments? Okay.
So as we look through organizational culture, and if we want to try to improve the organizational culture that we're in or help our managers understand organizational culture, there are a few resources here. I'm channeling Jez. Jez suggested I learn how to speak in a British accent. That's not happening. So Jez's favorite story is Numi. There was this auto manufacturing plant that had horrible, horrible success. Everything broke. They had just the worst success rates of making cars. Everything broke down. They would actually insert things into doors just to make them rattle. So what they did is they took everyone in the plant and they sent them to Japan to learn how to make cars the Toyota way. And they shipped them all back. And it was a culture fit, right? It was learning how to do things a different way culturally. And it completely turned the plant around. And so there's a link to that radio episode. You can also read it if you prefer to read it in the Sloan MIT review, or you can read about Toyota Kata. Gene also mentioned job satisfaction. #1 predictor of organizational performance. So we've been talking about IT perf and org perf. So IT perf is your IT performance of your team. That's DevOps. Org perf is the bottom line of your organization. This is your company. Job satisfaction is the #1 predictor of organizational performance. Happy cows make happy cheese. Happy people make rich companies. It's in your company's best interest for you to be happy. And this is not just you being happy, but this is giving you the tools and the resources that you need to get your job done. Okay? And we found, and this has been known for years. Okay? This isn't anything new. But it was really good for us to verify this again in a brand new context, right? This is always good for us to know. And top predictors of job satisfaction: high trust organizational culture, climate of learning, win-win relationships between ops, dev, and infosec, proactive monitoring and auto-scaling, use of version control for all production artifacts, and automated testing. And this came through in all of our data across all sizes of organizations, across all sizes of infrastructures. We saw this over and over and over again. Some of our surprises. Gene. 3 minutes.
Yeah, 3 minutes. This is, at the Velocity conference, we actually did some data analysis as some questions came in. One of the questions was, can large organizations be high performers? In other words, I think this is their way of saying, we can't be a high performer because we're a large organization, right? So we actually tested that.
Yeah.
So on this graph here, on the y-axis is the size of the organization. So employee count, 10,000, 500 to 10,000, all the way down to 1 to 4. And so here's my read of the data. Essentially, it suggests that, yeah, among the high performers, if you're a large organization of 10,000 employees or more, you're half as likely to be a high performer versus if you were an organization of 500 employees. And yet, the point is, even in organizations of 10,000 employees or more, there's 20% of the organizations are high performers, are achieving the same sort of unicorn-like properties that you would see in a Google, Amazon, so forth, right? And so I think this would evoke. My assertion would be they are winning in the marketplace at the expense of those who are not, right? So that's one surprise. The other surprise was we can't be a high performer because we're in a large organization, and things like continuous delivery, continuous testing, high trust management models, they just are impossible to have in the high performance. So we tested that again. So this time, the size of the organization is on the y-axis, and think about each one of the lines as the level of excellence for each one of those technical practices that we measured. And the way I read this is that, whether you're a large organization or a small organization, it is about the same. In fact, one could argue, because the line goes actually up, that large organizations are even better than small organizations, except for one, the red line, which is this notion of change approval, right? So, this seems to indicate that in large organizations, you actually have a very, very powerful change advisory board, right? Where it's very difficult to just, get away with not doing change approval. So, I think that's an inherent, maybe disadvantage of being a large organization.
Mm-hmm. I'll say that my biggest surprise was that DevOps practices actually impacted organizational performance. I'll say that I told the team that I threw it in there because, well, yeah, of course it impacts the organization, right? No. 30, 40, 50 years of research show that IT investments don't impact the organization at all, ever. The big, famous research shows zero correlation. So the fact that we found impact is huge, and we're excited about it, and we're following up on it right now. Right now we're out of time, so.
Yeah, if you're interested in, where was that? We actually created a Google Plus group. If you are interested in helping shape the direction of next year's study, go to this link, bit.ly/future state of DevOps. And we actually reached out for reviewers for the benchmarking study. So if you're interested in that, join us there. We're formulating another survey of practice.
Yeah, for next year. So
next year.
We'll be following on, and thank you for everyone's time.
Thank you.